Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm L'Shawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching.
So today, L'Shawn and I are going to explore a topic that has been coming up over the past few months over and over and over again in my own lived experience and my participation in the work that I do with my clients, and then in relationships with family members as well. And this topic today is all about our strengths and sometimes how we can see them as negatives, whether our own strengths in ourselves or when we see the strengths in other people, we sometimes often will think of those as negatives because they're not like us, for example, or there's something wrong with them, for example. When in fact, I think the language could be shifted to is everybody's living in their strengths and they could just use coaching or a little bit of support to draw them out of themselves, to be able to use them in a way that helps them live the life they want to live. And so personally for me, this comes back to my own life and how I have noticed my own strengths showing up throughout the past few months. And I have been kind of pushing them aside like, oh, I don't want to respond to that because that's showing off, or that's a bad thing to do, or all of these narratives that I have built up in my own head about what truly are my own strengths. And so, for example, on the Myers-Briggs, I am an ENFJ, which means I'm extroverted, intuitive, feeling, and kind of planning, judgment, kind of moving forward type of thinker and feeler. And oftentimes, these get me into a lot of trouble, even with myself, because I'll be like, oh, I was too extroverted there. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Or, I'm relying way too much on my intuition instead of logic or things like that. And it's such an interesting conversation that I have with myself, because when I look back at this conversation that I'll have with myself, I can see that I'm shoving away my own strength. And it's not about this over reliance on our own strengths. I mean, we can get into trouble when that happens for sure, but it is about being able to own our strengths and live in them and be okay with where they are directing us, rather than thinking we have to be directing them and they're wrong or they're bad, for instance. So this is what's been going on in my mind and being over the past few months, especially in terms of speaking engagements. I really enjoy them. And then I'm like, oh no, I don't want to do a speaking engagement because that means I'm showing off, or that means that, I don't know, I'm putting myself out there in a strange way. When in fact, if you look at even just the Myers-Briggs, for example, I've taken a lot of different personality assessments, but even just the Myers-Briggs, for example, speaking engagements make a ton of sense. Like that's who I am, right? But to own that is scary, vulnerable. And sometimes whether that's perceived judgment or when you get judgment from others, it can feel like I don't want to be that person that I'm probably truly meant to be. So I just kind of rambled on a stream of consciousness here about this topic, just to kind of maybe layer in some nuance about what we're talking about here today. And we're talking about our strengths and how we tend to push those away in ourselves, and then how we tend to see fault with other people's strengths in themselves, in others. And I think it's a really powerful tool in coaching to discover. And I think it's also a powerful tool to bring more peace and agreeableness in our world today. L'Shawn, where are you at now that I just kind of, I don't know, I feel like I dumped a bunch of different things there, but yes.
Yeah, there are a lot of things there that the things that were coming up for me when you were talking was the idea that often we will spend more time fighting for our shortcomings, our shortfalls, things that are not going well for us. And I think it does have something to do with the way that our brains are wired. We notice things that are different or things that are out of place, or we notice things that aren't going well. And we rarely notice and appreciate the things that are working. And we take for granted those things. Like our strengths are the things that come naturally to us. And they could be things that we've developed over time as well. I'll acknowledge that as well. But for the most part, as you were saying when you were talking about the personality profiles that the personality tests that you've taken and how it's shown up, how the results have shown up, it just seems like, yeah, that's me. That's how I show up. Those are my strengths, right? And then I think it's easy to criticize those strengths or see them as not as good as perhaps someone else's strengths, or even if you do see someone else's strengths as negative in terms of maybe they conflict with the way that you work, like your communication style or the way that you work or the way that you see the world. And one of the things that is also coming up for me, when I work with clients or when I talk with friends, often what I hear is people talking about the things that they want but don't have, and then not really being able to lean in or leverage the strengths that they have to get the things that they want and don't have. Those are things that rarely come up spontaneously in sessions. Often it's asking that powerful question. For example, if someone is in a situation where they feel like they don't have the resources or they're not sure what to do, often I'll ask the client, is there a similar situation that you were in the past that you were able to get through? Let's look at some of the resources you used there and tactics that you used and see if we can apply it to this new situation, this new problem that you're facing. Because often when we can access resources or when we can look back at a time when we couldn't, that we got through a challenge or we met a challenge and we were able to overcome hardship, we forget that's something that's an accomplishment. That's something that I was able to solve. I came up with a solution. And now that I'm facing a problem or I'm facing a situation where I feel like I have fewer resources and I'm just kind of spinning my wheels, we don't often go back to that time when, I was here before and I found a way. So maybe I can find a way here. So I think that a lot of it has to do with just not being conditioned or used to looking at, appreciating, and being even curious about our strengths. Just, I think that we have a tendency to focus on the things that are not going right. We have a tendency to, like, if we see a problem, we have a tendency to really look at the problem and see all of the things that make it a problem rather than the flip side, which is what is the solution? And getting excited about the solution. Because often what happens is people get caught up in the emotion and the suffering that is a result of the problem. And so it's difficult, sometimes challenging to flip it around and be more solution focused. Spending a lot of time on the problem as if we really accentuate or if we really understand the problem, then we can come up with a solution. When it might be, we might serve us better if we jump off of the problem and go, okay, there's a problem. So there must be on the flip side a solution to that problem. Those are some of the things that I was thinking about in terms of like what you were saying, Eryn. And a question that I have, I'm really curious about is where do you think it comes up? Like, where do you think we learn to focus on the things that are going wrong or focus on the problems? Where do you think that comes up in life? Like, if you look at it personally, Eryn, when do you think was the first time that it was brought to your attention to focus on problems or focus on weaknesses or that kind of thing?
Well, that question I know is different for everybody, but
Everyone,
I grew up in
yeah.
a very hypercritical, problem focused, nothing, you're never going to be good enough kind of framing,
Mhm.
upbringing. And there's some positives from that for sure, right? But there's also, it's just part of kind of what started to develop this kind of misalignment with my own strengths, or not me, not appreciate, not misalignment, me not appreciating my own strengths and how they can be used. But on the flip side of that, even more importantly, I think, is from day one in our society, it's all about othering. They're different. This is different. Even in school, there's so much of that going on. And when in fact, maybe that's their strengths, right? And I think that that's such an important element in today's society for us to take a step back and use some of these personality assessments to better understand ourselves and understand others rather than saying, oh, that's a bad person over there. Well, let's take a look at what's really going on. What are their strengths? What are their opportunities to use their strengths? I can't believe that it didn't take me until, and we've talked about this in a different episode, until being really taught about strengths and how to use them with other people when I was working at CU. It took me all of that time past graduate school into the working world to understand that concept. We just aren't exposed to it either, I think, growing up. We get hyper focused, I think, either on ourselves and like maybe larger systems where we completely miss the other person in front of us, even in sibling relationships, right? It's like this person's personality assessment could be completely opposite or completely different. And those are their strengths, but I see that as I don't want to work with them because it's really hard to find common ground, or I'm really struggling to have good communication with them. So, like you mentioned with communication skills, right? Like that's wrapped up in this too. And I think that that's what's so nuanced and so difficult about where do we bring this more into our society. And I think a challenge is it's not always evidence-based programming. What's the research on this personality assessment? And a lot of them, there's a ton of research, there's statistically valid surveys, but still that's not enough for a lot of people, right? But I think it would be a huge benefit to help us at the individual level of conflict, the societal level of conflict, and really help us better understand each other too if we had more intentional programming around strengths-based education. And I think it helps people better understand their purpose, their values. I know we've talked about values quite a bit on this podcast. And so, yeah, I didn't have that explicit understanding until much more into adulthood. And I know, I'd worked in the past on school behavioral health policies for the state of Colorado. And we worked a lot on kind of a multi-tiered model to support students where they were at socially and emotionally. But what I think is missing in that often is the depth and the nuance of what this really means and how this could really be taught. Of course, the challenge with that is where do you fit that into a already packed curriculum? We can only do our best. And I totally understand that as well. And so even today, having all this background and all this knowledge, still get frustrated with other people. And I have to pause and be like, wait, am I actually frustrated with their strengths? Well, that's an interesting take versus they're just annoying or they're just not doing it the right way or their beliefs are, immoral or what, all those things. When in fact, I could totally shift that conversation in my mind to just say, those are their strengths. How are they getting to use them? How are we creating conditions in our society where people get to use them? And how are we having conversations about this and hard conversations about this? And so I think there's so many layers to how strengths relate to communication, how they relate to our values, and how they can then be used for self-understanding and relationship building. And so, yeah, that's a big task. And I know as coaches, we take that on with our clients when we sit there and listen and help them pull out their own strengths. Maybe it's not even an assessment. We do what is called strength spotting in coaching, where we recognize the strengths of our client and let them know what those are as they continue to have those conversations with us. And so wouldn't it be interesting if we did strength spotting with people we maybe don't agree with as much or we don't understand as much? Because I mean, even at the broadest level we're at politically right now, what would it be like for Congress to have those conversations and really understand? It's like going back to the basics that were never taught. We're trying to build something that should have been built a long time ago. And again, I know that gets tricky because then it's like, oh, you're trying to say we should have a specific moral system for our country, things like that. It can get kind of gray and dangerous. And I get that piece too. But I think because we've left it out so much, it's really challenging, especially in today's age where, most teens and kids are on their cell phones all the time, not interacting, not even aware of their own strengths, probably, let alone the person sitting next to them. There, I was actually just around teenagers this weekend, and what really kind of surprised me on one piece was just this idea of reality being so wrapped up in a phone when in fact
Mhm.
what they are reading is mostly false. It's not factual information.
Mhm.
And so there's a lack of awareness to even be in touch with ourselves and our own learning. So I don't know. There's so much here, but I do think that if we can identify our own strengths and help people understand theirs, I think it's helpful.
Yeah, as you were talking, one of the like themes in our podcast has been to be curious and curiosity. And one thing that I was thinking about while you were talking is how curiosity is the antidote to judgment. And it would be, and one of the things that really came up for me was when you were talking about things that annoy you or maybe that you would disagree with about other people could be their strengths. And that is something I hadn't thought about before. And I like that you brought that up because it changed my perspective of certain situations where conflicts arise and there's a clash of personalities. To be curious about the other person and how they navigate the situation leveraging their strengths rather than focusing on how their strengths are conflicting with my strengths or another person's strengths. Just to get curious and see, hey, how are their strengths in this situation or their perspective of this situation? How is that going to expand and clarify my understanding of this situation? Because it's like the blindfolded or the blind people who are trying to figure out an elephant. They are able to interact with only parts of the elephant, and so the aspects that they can touch and that they are aware of only tell part of the story of what this creature, the elephant, is. And I think that that is essentially any situation is an elephant. We have our access to the trunk, and another person has the access to the tail, and another person has the access to the broad side of the elephant. And until we actually stop and are curious about perhaps what I am touching is part of a whole, and maybe another person who is in this situation, another person who is looking at the same problem or looking at the same situation might have another part to that whole. And if we can, put down our need to be right, our need to um, stay in our comfort zone, if we can put that down and we can say, hey, I'm really curious. I want to know the whole. I want to understand the whole. And I know that because of the nature of being human, I only have part of the whole. And therefore, I need other people, people who may have a different perspective that is so different from anything that I could imagine that this whole would be, because I'm touching something that is very narrow and long. And how in the world could something the size of a wall be attached to that? No, I can't believe that. But if we can set aside those beliefs that we have, that the whole has to, that part has to be characteristic of the whole, like it's characteristic of the whole, but it's not the whole. So then we have to expand our understanding and our ability to receive or to be receptive to the possibility that something long and cylindrical, like a rope, could be attached to something as wide as a wall. What? Maybe. So, can you get curious and can you maybe find out more and ask those powerful questions that can broaden your awareness of the whole. And then be also aware that this other person that you're talking to, Yes, there's another piece of the whole, but it's not the whole. So, is there another person that's not part of this conversation who might also have a piece of the whole? Let's go find them. Let's go listen to them so we together can figure out what this thing is. What is the situation? What are all the pieces and parts and factors? And I think that's one of the questions that we have to ask is who isn't in this conversation? What am I not looking at? What am I not seeing? And how can I find the answers that I'm looking for? How can I see more? And sometimes the answer to that is letting down your guard and trusting another person and, talking to them and seeing what their experience is, what their lived experience is. So they might be coming at the situation based on, their past experience. And as you are coming into the situation, the past experience. But when you're in a situation like I'm feeling like today, what's going on today seems so different from anything I've ever experienced. And when I talk to people who are older than I am, people who have seen, like the civil rights movement of the 60s, who are part of that, they tell me this is like unlike anything I've ever seen. And so it's like, wow, how can we figure this out together? And just say we want to flourish as humans. We want to do well. And we know that we can't do that alone. And how do we get curious about how we can do that together as a group? That's some of the things that I was thinking about while you were talking.
No, I love the elephant metaphor and visualization. It makes things, it really crystallizes our conversation. So thanks for sharing that piece because I could really feel into a little bit of my own softening. Sometimes I'll get a little judgmental of like, come on, let's go, let's figure this out. And it's just a reminder of your other point that you made that we can when we can move into curiosity mode. I think that can be really helpful. And you're right. I hear this from people as well that this feels different right now with where we're at as a country. And so I feel, part of our podcast, or most of our podcast, is about how do you bring these coaching concepts to everyday life, which we've been really talking about. And it's not just necessarily about the coaching methodology or the one-on-one coaching practice, but it is about this larger call for us to engage with each other, come up with ideas. Like it's so fun to be in a room and brainstorm ideas, and there's no attachment to where they came from. It'd be interesting to do that as an exercise. Like every senator is, they're all blindfolded in a room or something, or I don't know, you can't do voice recognition or anything. And they're just shouting out ideas to solve something, not sure where it's coming from at all, right? Like that's overly idealistic because that's not how our political system works. It should be more creative and brainstorming in that way, you would think, but just to have non-attachment and less stakes to where the ideas are coming from. What do they look like? We have a lot of smart people, right, in our country. We have a lot of wise people. We have a lot of people who are engaged. We have a lot of people who want to make a difference. And they all have their unique strengths. So that's the hope and the challenge, I think, because of those unique strengths, there is a little bit of a rub in that people don't want to collaborate. On the other end of that, because of the unique strengths, that's how we get really innovative and effective ideas put out into the world and things like that. So how do we bridge that gap to seeing both of the strengths within ourselves and others, going back clear to the beginning of this conversation, and really inviting those into the conversation across all of the political aisles within local and state and federal governments, those sorts of things. Even, there used to be more of a call too, I feel like, and for younger voices. I think growing up, it'd be like, oh, submit this idea, or, as a kid, and you could win this prize or whatever. I'm not seeing that as much with my young kids right now, but maybe that's something that is there and we're just missing out on that opportunity. But just that level of engagement, I think, can be fostered by strengths, and it's going to be messy and hard, but I don't know. I'm kind of like vacillating in my own being right now between like this sense of hope and the sense of hopelessness. And I could tie that back to my strengths, right? I could try that back to the ENFJ and see how that relates and what I can do to get a little unstuck and find a pathway forward. So,
I'm thinking more along the lines of like I think that if we look at it like the macro level, if we look at it like the federal level, if we look at Congress, and I think that can get really big. I think it would be it feels more hopeful for me to think about like how can I create spaces where we are being curious about each other's perspectives? Because I believe that the micro is often a reflection of the macro, and it can also affect the macro at the macro level. And if we can create spaces at the local level, or even just in our sphere of influence, that would feel like we're moving forward. Because I think that it's easy to like look at, oh, our senators and our representatives should be doing this. Um, and it seems absolutely we could like write to our local, congressperson or senator or representative and say, hey, I think I would really feel um, better about the government, and I would have more trust in the government if you would work towards um, opening the government again, or if you would work towards go across the aisle more, if you would be more curious about what the other side is saying and less condemning of the other side. Something along those lines, like just, putting out your desires to, your state representative and, talk to send an email or call their office. Definitely. And I think that one of the things that comes up for me is just a desire to create spaces where we can do that on like a local level, and we can bring that into spaces that seem more accessible to me, and like where can we find time, like town hall meetings, that kind of thing, where we can practice that curiosity and we can apply those strategies that we use in coaching to interact with our citizens, like our fellow citizens, and where we can be curious about where somebody is coming from in a situation that we're in, currently. So if we could just like use that as a kind of a way of interacting with other people, and then expand it into bigger conversations online or in person would be nice, just have meetups or uh, events where we're talking to each other and we're finding creative ways to kind of trick people into working together. you know, so it's not like it should be intentional,
yeah.
but I was thinking like how can we create situations in which we kind of break down barriers in a way that happens naturally. So like I'm thinking like strand them on an island. Have all the people, that are supposedly representing different types of like perspectives and backgrounds, like the really ultra
Yeah.
conservative Christian on an island with, a trans activist, and like they have to figure it out. Like, they
Yeah.
gotta figure it out. You gotta figure out how to get off the island. Put aside your
Oh my goodness.
differences
I've been
and
binging
figure it out.
Lost. And so you're talking about the island. I'm like, oh my goodness.
Guess we're all on the same wavelength.
Yeah. I think one thing,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, I just think as you were talking, one thing it is like when we other the person, I think it's a big challenge. But what if we just one framing? This is just an idea to throw out there. Recognizing the person has just as many strengths as you do, you have just as many strengths as they do. Don't other them, but you can critique their idea or be curious about their idea. I see so often people get into name calling mode. That person is a da, 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 or he never gets
Hmm.
it because blah 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 blah. And that
Hmm.
could be true, but I think that doesn't get us very far in the
Hmm.
conversations. So it's more about, okay, I think this idea is not helpful, and here's why. Here's something I can bounce back to you, just like in coaching, in our brainstorming
Hmm.
parts of our coaching sessions, where we're constantly brainstorming back and forth ideas on how to come up with um, maybe a next step or even a small goal or even a word, right? That helps us move forward in some level of peace and understanding and self understanding and hope. And so I think one thing I'd like to see and I'd like to be more aware of in my own self is making sure that I'm not in that name calling mode and really more in the okay, what's going on with the idea mode.
Yeah. No, I like that idea of looking at the ideas rather than the person and the othering. I think the othering can really make it easy for us to totally dismiss a good idea. As long as it's coming from the other, I'm not going to listen. It can't possibly be okay. And I also want to go back to like your idea because I think it's like possible to do that. It's very possible to have different people contributing their ideas in a way that's anonymous and that you wouldn't know if it was coming from, you know, um, one side of the aisle or the other. And they could easily do that through, on the internet, making it anonymous, just having ideas. There's all kinds of different software out there and apps out there where you can contribute your ideas, like on a virtual bulletin board or something like that, where different people are putting ideas on the board. But I want to go back to this one thing that popped up when you were talking, and that was that I think it's really important for us to understand where everybody's coming from. Like, what is the motivation? For example, if you have like a debate, so classically, the main purpose of a debate is to get to the truth, the objective truth. This is so layered and complex because not everyone believes in objective truth. And this kind of goes back to when I look at clips of conservative Christians talking to people who believe that there's relative truth and then people who believe that there's objective truth. And that is where is they're kind of talking past each other. And if you don't have like a common ground, so I think we need to find a common ground. Otherwise, you're just going to be talking past each other. One person can be curious about the other person. The other person could have one thing they have in mind, and that is, I am right, and I'm going to prove myself right, and I'm going to prove you wrong. In order to be right, the other person has to be wrong. So if we're not having a dialogue or a debate, the two are different. But if we're having like a dialogue, for example, dialogues specifically are for just, putting your ideas out there. Nobody's judging right or wrong. You're just getting your ideas. You're learning about each other. That's the other thing. Are we in this to learn? Are we in this for objective truth? Are we in this to come up with a compromise? Or are we in this to prove the other person wrong? And I think that is going to that could possibly determine, and I'm willing to be wrong, but that could possibly determine the course of of a conversation or the outcome of a conversation where you might leave feeling really defeated or disappointed. Like, what was the point of this? And the other person might leave feeling like, oh, I met my goal. I'm right. The other person is wrong. I'm right. So it's if you come into a conversation with someone or you come into a discussion with a group of people, I think it's really important to clarify, why are we here? And you might spend a lot of time going, okay, why are we here? We're here because we want everyone in the city to flourish. And we all have different ways making that possible. We have different definitions of what it means to flourish. But we really want to make a city where everybody flourishes. So then you have to like ask if that's what we're doing, then maybe we could come up with like an idea or a common theme of what it means to flourish. And we might have like self-determination, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, those type of things. I think that there is the need, though, to really know what the end goal is or why are we here? Why are we talking? Is it to put the other person down, to prove the other person wrong? Is it to come up with one dominant way of being that we're going to coerce everyone else to follow? And that's where I think it gets a little sticky when you have different reasons for coming to the table and it's not articulated and it's not clarified. And so you leave with being at the negotiating table. What are we negotiating? What do we want to leave this negotiating table with? So those are some of the things that I was thinking about in terms of like when we're talking to someone and we're trying to get we're looking at it with curiosity and we're looking at it as okay, this person's strengths, what is this person's strengths? They might be looking at it differently. They may be looking at it, okay, this person is wrong, and how am I going to prove this person wrong?
Yeah.
So,
I
and then you just cross purposes, right?
I have an example of where I failed at that yesterday. We were in the
Really?
car. I asked my high school niece a question, and then I chime in, kind of like, what about, I was a little more curious, but then when her, mom said something, I kind of snapped right back in terms of like, well, what about that? Like, a little aggressively,
Mhm.
right? And so, what was my goal in that conversation? Well, originally I was just curious when I asked the question, but it quickly turned to like me being right or like, let's understand more people. My ultimate goal, which was probably a little well intentioned, was not appropriate in the situation. It was like, okay, you're saying that only this group of people is doing something bad. And I'm saying, no, this is happening across these populations. But for me, I wanted more understanding and more kind of love for everyone. And what I
Mhm.
ended up doing was just making the conversation stifled,
Mhm.
unfeeling. Like it wasn't my best moment, I would say. But it's hard to do this in the moment, right? Because it can go like you said, we need to have these expectations laid out clearly in advance. Because when I
Mhm.
asked this question, I had no expectation, just curious, right? Like, what's her
Mhm.
perspective here? And then it quickly derailed, right? And so when we're having these everyday conversations with friends and family, it's just maybe a reminder when you're starting to notice that in yourself or in the conversation to take a step back. And even if it's been done, you can always go back and say, I felt like I was too aggressive here and sort of thing. So these things are so complex, right? I'm just like, oh my goodness. But it makes me wonder too, as a friend and colleague of yours, LaShawn, I'm curious, what are one or two strengths of yours that you underappreciate and undervalue within yourself?
Um, well, one thing that was kind of pointed out to me by a cousin of mine, it was in the past, but it's something that I always go back to because it's something that I don't notice or recognize in myself, and I often don't recognize it in myself, and that is my discernment and the way in which I make decisions. It's very logical, and I'm weighing pros and cons, and I'm looking at the different sides. And I remember I was at my cousin's house and my other cousin, her brother mentioned I was talking to them and there was this situation and I said, maybe I was rash or maybe I didn't come to the and he said to me, I have never, in all the time that I have known you, I've never known you to make a rash decision. You were always thinking about both sides and what's this and what's that. And then I was able to like take a step back and be like, yeah, because often I default to this kind of, I don't know what's going on, kind of persona that I put out there. And I think I do that partly to make other people feel, I don't know, less threatened or something, I often dumb down or play down my intellect. And I play down my decision, like my decisiveness and my ability to kind of look at all the different sides and make a decision very carefully. And I would say that's a strength that I do not recognize in myself until you ask a question like this, or until, someone like my cousin calls me out and says, no, or calls me in maybe and says, hey, I've never known you to make a rash decision. You're always weighing the pros and cons. You're always looking at all the different sides. And he says, and trust yourself. That's the other thing he said to me. You need to trust yourself because you're an intelligent person who makes good decisions. And then I look back at my life and say, yeah, for the most part, I make pretty good decisions. I am very, you know, um, measured in that. How about you, Erin? What is a strength of yours that you don't recognize or that you don't appreciate as much as you should?
Well, before I get to that, I want to highlight it sounds like you have a strength of diplomacy, a strength of strategic thinking, a strength of um, agreeableness, or all of these things. So there's so much more in there too. So all the layers
Hmm.
of strengths, can be pulled out in this example, I guess, and also how we, help clients do that too. But just like when you start to then pare them all down, it's like, wow, this human being is a rock star, right? So that's something to hold on to too. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but for me, the strength that comes to mind that probably also is a challenge that people I think tend to name and I always kind of forget because it's a little bit of a tricky one to navigate is that they're like you have the head and the heart. You are a strong thinker and you care. You have that strong feeling piece too. And that was actually first told to me directly by a community member here in Longmont, actually. And then it just like started coming up again and again and again. And that puts me in a tricky situation sometimes because I feel a little bit like, oh boy, which am I going with here? The head, the heart. But I do find that a way through it and I find a way to really merge them to um, be a caring leader. And that's the thing too. Like that's the other strength that people have always told me is that, I'm a caring leader. And it's interesting when I say this aloud because what does this mean in my life right now where I have kind of stepped out of a leadership role? Right. I mean, I lead my own business, but that's different it's not, I'm not leading people. And so it does make me curious about that too. How are these strengths being used in other ways now, right? They don't have to be so explicit. They can be still leveraged and still used in other ways. And so I don't know. It's so interesting that the strengths that come to mind when I frame them, I automatically go into thinking about how they relate to work rather than how they relate to my family. But I think that, or other roles that I hold, right? But I think that me just saying aloud, caring leader, head in the heart, not the band, although I do like that band, the head and the heart. um, just I can leverage that in my own family too, and maybe be a little bit more mindful of that as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I would say all those things. I see those strengths in you and the ability to hold space for people and because what you do is like grief and loss. So I think that is that's tricky for me. Just, like how do you hold space for someone who's grieving? And you are a shining example of how to do that. You have this way of sitting there and then allowing them to express their grief, and in that way you give that permission. So that's that caring, but you also have that it's measured by the or tempered, I should say, by your intellect and your ability to combine that caring with this very gentle and unobtrusive way of teaching. You have this way of teaching that allows the person to, experience the grief that they're feeling, but also be open to the knowledge that will help empower them in their grief or allow them to understand their grief better. And I think that you just have this way of mixing the two. And I haven't seen it in anyone else. So yes, your strengths are, again, watching you interact with people who are grieving specifically is just it's a very hopeful experience. And it's also empowering in itself because you can see that it's possible, one, and two, the modeling of it is possible as well because the way that you do it is so clear. That's the other thing. You're very good at clarifying and explaining complex things.
Oh, well, thank you. Man, I feel so good now.
As well,
you distilled down what I've needed to hear from my therapist for 10 years. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that I admire about you is your ability to clarify and explain complex things. Just I don't know, you have this gift of language and you have this gift of articulation. I don't even know what to call it. But yeah, reading your book, listening to you talk, seeing how you interact with other people, see how you interact with like how you hold space for me when I'm grieving, when I'm holding heavy and complex things. It's like you just see through it and you find a way through. It's pretty remarkable.
Oh, I am gonna cry.
That was not my intention.
Thank you. That was really heartfelt.
Mm.
It makes me, I guess, ready to jump into these coaching nuggets of wisdom because just the joy and the clarity, like you said, expressed when you share about someone else's strengths to them. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's such a gift in doing that. It's not just about your strengths, but when you can highlight those in others, it's just as helpful to you too. At least that was my experience in this last exercise as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that would be my coaching and nugget of wisdom throughout the next week. Find two people that you know well and tell them their strengths.
As a really great coaching nugget of wisdom. Uh, One thing that I was thinking about is where can you find ways to appreciate and acknowledge your strengths? Where have your strengths really brought gifts to your life? What are some good things about your strength and what can you celebrate about your strengths? Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm L'Shawn with Michelle Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.